we discussed basically the distribution of these psychoactive plants with a history of shamanic use, and then discussed a little bit about the history of them. And I didn't really finish with that because I want to stress that this, I think what we talked about this morning is we got them all to a good place. We got them all to paradise in Africa with clear vision, much food, and plenty of horsing around. And then we broke for lunch. The forces that created that partnership society in prehistory, the forces that allowed the emergence of a non-male dominant social style, were the same forces which then eventually destroyed it as well, because it was nothing more than climatological change is what was happening. As the African continent became drier, the grasslands retreated, the water holes became less frequent and further apart, and the mushroom came under pressure because of increased dryness. And at that point, I think probably the mushroom festivals became less and less frequent. The whole thing became more tenuous, and there was great pressure then to try and figure out how to preserve the mushrooms through the dry times of the year to have them available for ceremonies. And I think that it's the use of honey as a preservative that really set the stage for things to go wrong, because honey turns into a psychedelic compound on its own if you do nothing to it but leave it alone. It ferments, it becomes mead, and mead is a primitive kind of alcoholic beverage. So over several millennia, what began as an ecstatic mushroom cult turned into a beer cult, a cult of alcoholic intoxication. And then you get the same shift of ratios that you see in our own society. I mean, how many women in our own society have their first sexual experiences in an atmosphere of alcohol abuse and misuse? The two almost go together, and less in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, it's almost possible to imagine nobody got laid for 1,000 years in the West without being pretty juiced up, because it was pretty unappetizing, I imagine. So this is a way in which sensory modalities and emphasis on different aspects of psyche change over time without a culture even being aware of it. And then I talked this morning a little bit about the fall into history, the neurotic dysfunctionalism that characterizes historical existence. And I think it's worth going back to that, because some people have the idea that psychedelics are a kind of instant psychotherapy and that they address the concerns of the individual, but they're not concerned to link it up to history, to see what it was for us in the past and what its absence has done for us. I think that the whole phenomenon that we call the fall into history is the scenario of abandonment that we underwent as we broke the umbilical connection to the Gaian matrix of organic life. That's what we were embedded in this African context. But when Africa dried up and we moved out of Africa and into the Middle East, we then were transformed from nomadic pastoralists into primitive agriculturalists, and then later city builders, and the entire pattern of male dominance and anxiety is set in place. If you look at the world of 7000 BC, the most sophisticated human structure on the earth of, let's say, 7500 BC is at Jericho in what is now Palestine. And what is it? It's a grain storage tower built at Jericho 72-75 BC. It indicates that the primitive pastoral nomadic form has given way now to an agricultural form that allows for the accumulation of surplus, and hence the need to defend same, and hence the establishment of have and have not psychology, and so forth and so on. So all of the institutions that we now must attempt to reform and grapple with began then. Urbanization, kingship, male dominance, representative politics, all of these things begin then and are further exacerbated a couple or 3,000 years later by the Western decision to go with a phonetic alphabet as a method of communication. See, a phonetic alphabet further removes you away from anything concrete or real or related to nature. There's no ideogram, there's no glyph, there isn't even a rebus. There is simply an abstract symbol which stands for a sound. I mean, this is about as far away from the hands-on approach of language that you could get. Well, the culture that made these decisions, which is our culture, the culture of Europe and the ancient Middle East, has evolved into the dominant culture on the planet and has put in place institutions like science and so forth and so on. Our metaphors have grown ever more cogent in their ability to manipulate matter and energy as they have evolved less and less relevance to ourselves. So now we have ideological systems of tremendous power that none of us can understand or relate to, which is a kind of an odd relationship to knowledge, since knowledge is supposed to be an experience of empowerment, not an experience of disempowerment. But our society has done it differently, and so we all wander around with a sense of disempowerment because we're surrounded by accomplishments that we couldn't possibly duplicate. Well, I mention all this because I think that it shows where the solution lies. If we were in balance 15,000 years ago, and it was achieved through the use of psychedelics, de-emphasis of the ego, non-existence of the nuclear family, and the suppression of the concept of ownership, we should look at these as possible styles of existence that might be put in place in the future. That's this psychedelic society that you've heard me talk about at various times. Well, that's probably enough on that. Oh, you thought so too. When I said we'd look at the geographical distribution, the history, and then the phenomenology, I thought that we would put most of the phenomenology of the thing in here, in this section, because it's important to establish just what we're talking about, and also to empower people to describe their own experiences, which are often so peculiar that unless there is a group such as this, a person tends to just define themselves as starkers. I mean, what else can you say about some of this? But, you know, if you're Starkers and you get 10 people to agree with you, you're not Starkers anymore, you're a movement. So I mentioned this morning about DMT, and I made of it the kind of paradigmatic compound because it's so brief, so natural, so powerful, so quick to recover from. And it's also a very good paradigmatic case when talking about what the psychedelic experience is like to have, because I think if you have the DMT experience, on the way to the center of that flash, you'll probably have all the other ones. It seems to lie at the center of the mandala. The most startling thing about the DMT flash, and I mentioned this morning when we were talking about Jung, is how astonishing it is. That death by astonishment seems the major danger. And this is even if you're an art historian, a Jungian, an aficionado of symbols, and so forth and so on. It seems to come from some dimension orthogonal to the human world. And it is not a unitary experience, the way the famous white light and all these other wordless, indescribable, elusive, mercurial things are. It isn't like that at all. It's extremely multiplistic, and it's extremely specific in its presentation. And when you smoke DMT, you have the feeling that you have burst into a place, that you have not had a psychological experience, you are not having a mental experience, you have burst into some kind of a space. And within that space, the first shock is that it's inhabited. And this is the shock I've never recovered from, because it was just the last thing I expected to find inside a chemical compound was the equivalent of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. It is inhabited by entities, is the only word to describe them. And they are, as I've said many times, they are like jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs. And there are many of them. And they come out of the background and they present themselves to you. They're literally vibrating up and down with excitement. They're faceted and rotating. And they see you as clearly as you see them. They even greet you. Some of you may recall the old Pink Floyd song, "The Gnomes Have Learned a New Way to Say Hooray." I think it's on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It's the first album. Those Floyd fans who were looking puzzled, it's because it was 40 years ago or something. Anyway, as you burst into this space, the gnomes say hooray, and they present themselves, and they are truly the gnomes of Central European fairy tales, archetypal gnomes. They are they're very humorous. They're very mercurial and delightful, but I think it's Jung warns against the humor of the spirit Mercurius because it can turn on you. It's not a friendly humor. It's too crazy. Too many plates are being thrown. Too many cars are exploding. It's like a Marx Brothers cartoon that hovers just on the edge of changing from mayhem to mania. You know, very intense. And the most striking thing to me, and really the motivation for my career, is they are displaying new models of language that have never been seen before. They sing, and out of their singing elfin chatter condense objects which look like nothing at all in this world. I mean, the closest I've been able to come to them are the the eggs of Fabergé, you know, these constructs in sapphire and ivory and crystal and vitreous glass that the French designer Fabergé created. Well, these things are like that, but they're like that raised to some excruciating pinnacle of completion, because as they show you these objects, you know beyond any possibility of contravention that if a single one of these objects were to exist in this world, it would change this world forever. If a single one of these objects were to exist in this world, we would spend 1,000 years studying this object. The last time this happened was a guy gave a speech up on a hill about moral obligation. We studied it for 1,000 years. This is this same kind of thing. And these Fabergé hyperdimensional objects are themselves undergoing a dynamic transformation. They're not static objects like the Fabergé eggs. They are undergoing changes, singing, condensing other objects. These objects are crawling all over the ground in front of you, clamoring for your attention. Now remember, 12 seconds before you were sitting in a suburban living room somewhere grappling with some drug somebody wanted you to take. Now all that's gone, and here are these things. I call them tykes because I wanted to capture the sense of their childlikeness. I don't know why I called them tykes, actually. It just seemed like the appropriate thing. If some of you are classicists or students of the literature of the pre-Socratic philosophers, you might recall the 52nd fragment of Heraclitus, which says, the aeon is a child at play with colored balls. The aeon is a child at play with colored balls. And when you break your way into the presence of the aeon, it's extremely I don't know, it's upsetting. You can't believe it's happening. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance. You could believe this if it just weren't happening to you. And there is this tremendous affection and interest in humanity, and then there is urgency, a lot of urgency. The tykes want to initiate you. They have a message. And the message is, you can do what we are doing. And what they're doing is using their voices to make physical objects condense out of the air. And they're saying, you can do this. Do it. Do it. Do it. And they're on you. And they jump in and out of your chest, which is something that is described in the Amazon, too, the hikuli, in the tryptamine snuff cults of the Yanomamo. They jump in and out of your chest, and they are saying, do this thing, do it, suspend your belief, and eventually you do it. You discover that you can drop the filter of meaning, that your voice can move back several registers, and out comes elf chatter. And this elf chatter is able to wring the air in front of you like a washcloth and get alchemical gold to drip out of the air and to begin to condense in front of you. Well, by this time, most people would like to call time out so they can make phone calls to various philosophers. But there's no time out. It just keeps going. And these things have the aura of strangeness, of alienness is palpable. There's an emotion in there that we just don't have in this world, because it's composed of unbelievable alienness in the presence of unbelievable familiarity. It's an ecstasy that is a coincidentia oppositorum. Simultaneously, it is both what it is and what it is not. And the human mind can't handle that. That's called cognitive dissonance. I mean, you just go into a conniption fit of some sort. Well, the very first time I smoked DMT in 1967, with absolutely no expectation, this happened to me. And it has happened every time since. And then I've had occasion to observe people taking DMT in countries where it's legal. And what I see is there is an archetype which surrounds DMT, which you must make your way through it. But at the center of the archetype is not present, and only the alien is present. The archetype is that of the circus or the carnival. The carnival. Think for a moment about the carnival. It has two aspects. One is blazing light and activity. At the center of the triple ring, the lady in the spangled costume is high above the main floor, and the lions and the tigers and the clowns are parading around. That's part of it. But it has another aspect. Just off to the side of the big tent, there are the sideshows, the hoochie-coochie dancers, the two-headed man, and so forth and so on. In other words, there's this kinky, peculiar shadow side of it. And I often, if any of you are fans of the film of Federico Fellini, here's a man who understood the archetype of the circus, and how, if you remember in Amarcord, that circus, or if you remember in Giulietta di Spiri, the flaming doorway into the room with the bed springs and the crepe paper flames. These are carnival images that relate back to DMT. When you finally come into the center of it, these are all seen to be veils. It veils itself that way because that's how you, it's the old candy to the baby routine. It treats us as people who would like to go to the circus. And then it takes us to the circus. But then there is a revelation beyond that. And I don't know how many people present in this room have confronted the thing I'm talking about. I always, at this moment, am aware that some people are saying, my, doesn't he perfectly get it? And other people are saying, huh? What is this? What is this guy talking about? The point I want to make is it's real. It's not vague. You don't have to strain for it. Nobody wonders whether or not it happened to them. It's just like somebody walking up to you and taking you by the arm and saying, there's something I insist on showing you. Come this way, please. And it was the presence of the entities that shattered the person who I was, because I was a scientific rationalist, a reductionist. I had no room for elves in my cosmology. And here they were, hundreds of them. So it seems to me that this is a central question that shamanism has always dealt with, perhaps not with the kind of ontological sophistication that we imagine ourselves to have, but this is the question that must be asked. Who's in there? Who is this? There are at least three possibilities, and I'm not sure which is the most conservative. The first possibility is that we don't understand how the world is constructed, and that, in fact, there is a parallel universe running alongside of ours, full of elves who use a language to make objects. And then why you can burst through to this place on this one drug, then that raises, each explanation raises a lot of questions. Then the other possibility is, this is the Jungian possibility. And Jung, I can't remember which one it was, but one of the later things, he talks about these elves because of the Kibiri. The Kibiri are the alchemical children that appear in Act 3 of Faust that Jung spent a lot of time on these alchemical kibiri and the question of the homunculus. And he says at one place, I think he says, he describes them as autonomous psychic elements that have escaped from the control of the ego. This is a weird way to go about it. I mean, it's probably an accurate description, but how much does it tell us, you know? It means that the psyche is to be visualized as a half-gallon of mercury, and when we throw it on the floor, the mercury balls up and spreads everywhere, and each ball of mercury you look at, by gad, it has a little face looking back at you. That's because mercury is a mirrored surface. You're looking at your own psyche shattered into thousands of pieces around you. Another possibility, and one I leaned toward for years, and I still lean toward, because I've noticed the radical nature of your explanation diminishes with the distance since the last time you smoked DMT. The longer it's been, the more likely you are to have some humdrum notion that you can pour it into. So the humdrum notion that I settled on was, well, clearly these are just extraterrestrials. They don't come in silver ships demanding to be taken to the National Defense Agency. This is how they come. Why they come this way, who knows? They're coming through mind. Mind is the medium in which they travel. Where do they come from? Who knows? Can it even be located in the Newtonian space-time matrix? I mean, what do you want here? A star catalog number? Would that satisfy you? And then finally, and I think I've exceeded my number of possible explanations, and then finally the explanation, which is my current favorite, it's a little disturbing, and I haven't quite figured out what to do with it, but I have a sense we're on the right track here. The reason the DMT space feels so peculiar, both alien and excruciatingly familiar, is because these things in this other place represent what I call an ecology of souls. This place is the one place you never thought you were going to make a visit to and come back to chat it around the coffee maker. They're dead. That's who these things are. This is the realm of the dead. Well, I have to confess, in all of my psychedelic voyaging and idea mongering and all of that, I never was able to go that far, to reach that far in my imagination. It sort of had to be presented to me. But if you go to shamans worldwide and talk to them about their spirit helpers and say, you know, what's the deal with this, you know, who are these things? They say, well, these are the ancestors. Didn't you know? These are the ancestors. It's perfectly cut and dried and normal. I had occasion, I won't use his name to embarrass him, but I had occasion to expose a very well-known Tibetan high mucky muck to DMT. And he said after, he took it like a man, said afterwards, that is the lesser lights. That is the lesser lights. And if any of you are students of Mahayana Buddhism, you know that the lesser lights are the lights you see at the edge of the bardo. As you start into the 42-day process of dying, you encounter the lesser lights. This guy was saying to me, you cannot go further in the body and have any expectation of returning. In other words, once you see the lesser lights, you have stretched the umbilicus to matter to the breaking point. If you go one step further, it's eternity for you. Well, I don't know how I feel about this. The head tyke, I've had to then ask myself, the head tyke, is that me? Do you actually encounter your dead soul Is there a dimension where you are both simultaneously dead and alive, both simultaneously witness and observer? I don't know, but I certainly think that if we're going to use a conservative explanation for these things, the only theory more conservative than that they are dead people is the theory that says that they are nothing whatsoever. And that just simply will not serve. I think it would come as a tremendous surprise to 20th century civilization if, orthogonal to all our expectations of space flight and virtual reality and all this techno-schmechno stuff that we're lining up in front of us, there would be a broadside from 90 degrees out of the unexpected, and it would be a doorway swinging open into the realms beyond organic existence. I resisted this fiercely, but I just don't know what we're going to do with these DMT creatures if we don't, try to find a rational explanation. And any rational explanation will be exotic because the facts of the matter are exotic. Those of you who have not had this experience, who are sitting there thinking it would never happen to me, you're full of it. It will happen to you. This doesn't require the willful suspension of disbelief. This doesn't require a pure heart or dietary prescription. No, this is part of the human birthright. And the fact that we deny the existence of a non-human entity, intellectual intelligence on this planet, is just part of our heritage from rationalism. And, you don't have to take it very seriously, because rationalism, the philosophy that gives us permission to deny the invisible world, you know who founded the philosophy of rational materialism? Any takers? Aristotle was early. I think I'd give credit to René Descartes for modern materialism and rationalism. Well, you know who told René Descartes to found rationalism and materialism? An angel. Are you ready for this? This is a suppressed history episode in the history of human thought. Here are the facts, folks. 1619. René Descartes is 21 years old. He's a young Frenchman in search of adventure. He joins a Habsburg army that is going off to Prague to lay siege to Prague to put down an alchemical revolt there. They kick butt on these alchemists, win the war, and they're on their way back to France. And in September 1619, this French army camped at Ulm in southern Germany. Some of you may know Ulm as Einstein's hometown, and in fact that figures in our story obliquely, as you will see. This French army camps at Ulm, and René Descartes hits the hay, and in the middle of the night an angel appears to this young man in the radiance of his rooms and says, "The mastery of nature is to be achieved through number and measure." Modern science is founded, folks, right there, right then, by an angel. So how far away are the informing voices? How rational is rationalism? How material is materialism? All of you must know, I'm sure, the famous story of Kekule, the German chemist Kekule, who discovered the benzene ring. He was struggling with this problem in physical chemistry, could not figure it out, fell asleep in his study, and the Ouroboros serpent appeared before him in his dream and took its tail in its mouth. And he came out of a sound sleep and said, "I've got it." He walked to the blackboard, he drew the first benzene ring. angelic intervention, intervention from the unconscious. So the point of all this is to suggest that human history is completely interpenetrated by the peculiar, the non-human, that which has intentionality and affection for mankind, for humanity. And this is what shamans call to their aid. This is how the curing is done. It's done through these spirit helpers, they're called, elementals. And so far as I know, Jungianism is the only modern intellectual position where you can even raise this issue without having a net dropped over you. I mean, this is absolutely forbidden by the modern worldview. And yet it lies very, very close to the surface in our culture. I mean, as an example of how close to the surface it lies in our culture, consider for a moment Santa Claus. What's this about? Santa Claus is the master of the elves. The elves that he is master of are demon artificers. They make toys for the world's children in their vast underground toy shops. And where are these underground toy shops? At the North Pole. I don't have to tell a room full of Jungians that the North Pole is the axis mundi, Yggdrasil, the magic world ash, the center of the mandala. What are the colors of Santa Claus? Red and white, the colors of Amanita muscaria. Absolutely. What is the titulary animal of Santa Claus? Reindeer. Reindeer are very central to the Amanita muscaria cult because reindeer eat the mushroom and then excrete their urine, and this is thought to be a cleaner and easier way to take the mushroom than to take it on the so-called first pass. The second pass is after the reindeer have had it. Just an anecdotal aside, if you're ever in the Yakut Basin, one of the great perils of the intoxicated Amanita user is to crawl out of the yurt in the middle of the night to take a leak in the snow, and before you can back off, the reindeer come and knock you headlong because they want to get to this Amanita-flavored snow. So here is Santa Claus right in the center of our culture, and when you take it apart, all the motifs are there. The demon artificers, the elves, the cosmic axis, the magical flight. I mean, it's a beautiful example of the preservation of pagan psychedelic use into a modern context. What can we say about this? Oh, well, I know. One more thing I wanted to say about it. This program that these tykes are pushing is a language skills program. And we don't know how long people have been bursting into this place. This may be the source of language. Where did language come from? We learned it from elves in hyperspace. Is as good a possibility as any other. And this is still ongoing, this language reformation program. They want us to activate our language forming ability. And language in the DMT flash, as I said this morning, it's something beheld. Syntax is something potentially to be looked at, not to be heard. And we don't understand this because for us, language is something that you hear. We can't imagine a language that you see. But have you ever noticed the way in which we preserve clarity of intention in language with verbal metaphors. We say, I see what you mean. He painted a picture. It means we unconsciously believe that truth will be beheld. And some of you who are students of the ancient literature may know Philo-Judaeus, Hellenistic Alexandrine Jew, absolute contemporary of Christ, born before, died after. And in one of his treatises on the Logos, which he was always talking about, Philo-Judaeus presents an etymology of the word Israel, talking about the word Israel, and he says Israel means he who sees God. This is the meaning of the word Israel. And then he goes on to say this he who sees God. He's talking about that, and he says, what would be the more perfect Logos? Now, I should assume most of you know the Logos was an informing voice, a voice in the head, which was the sine qua non of Alexandrian spirituality. Socrates had it, Plato had it, the Logos. So Philo-Judaeus asks, what would be the more perfect Logos? And then he answers his own question. He says, the more perfect Logos would go from being would go from being heard to being beheld without ever crossing over a noticeable moment of transition. Well, that is precisely what you encounter in deep psychedelic experiences and the DMT flash. You behold the Logos. In the initiation of the experience, you don't behold it. You hear it. It sounds, in Michael Harner's wonderful phrase, like the sound of rushing water, or like the sound of tinkling bells. And it's very far away. And then it begins to come closer. You begin to form a picture of it in your mind the way you would form a picture of a Nepali marching band if you just heard it about a half mile away, and the pa, and it's getting bigger, coming closer. This is the elf parade, and when it finally comes into view, it actually goes, without ever passing over a noticeable moment of transition, from being heard to being seen, through the phenomenon of approach. You hear it before you see it, then you see it far away, then you see it very close, and when you see it very close, who cares what it sounds like, because you're seeing it. This more perfect Logos is what the tykes, the spiritual helpers, want to teach. And I think that it's important to spend a little time on this, because I think this would have tremendous historical impact upon our situation if we could, by hook or by crook, create a more visible Logos, a language which could be seen. You've probably all considered at some time or another, what would telepathy be like? And I think most people answer that question by thinking that telepathy would be for me to hear what you think. But how would it be if telepathy were for me to see what you mean? That's telepathy. If it puts you in the other guy's shoes, if you stand in the other person's shoes, you are the other person. To have a person's point of view is to be that person in regard to that single datum of experience. So I've spent time with virtual reality people and all these technical folks, because I think that visual language is something that wants to be born. And it may be that can be technologically coaxed into existence, that we're going to have to wear goggles and have fast computer, or it may be that it can be physiologically coaxed into existence. There may be drugs which shift the processing of language from being an auditory phenomenon to being a visible phenomenon. Ayahuasca is an excellent candidate for this. if you spend time with the ayahuasca-taking populations in the Amazon, there's great stress in these populations on acquiring what's called an icaro. Icaro means magical song, and the icaro is a spontaneous chant-like song which comes to you during the intoxication. The thing that's interesting about these icaros is that they are critiqued as visual objects, not as sound. People never say of an icaro, it sounded beautiful. They always say, it looked lovely. And then people will say, but there should have been more blue. This kind of thing. It's clearly being criticized as a visual modality. Well, I think that these ayahuasca-using people are at the cutting edge of evolution. They are forcing the evolution of the modality of language. It may be that the processing of language is not hardwired, not physiologically wired. It's a software function having to do with culture, language, upbringing, and so forth. Because some people claim they are great visualizers and that they do think visually and so forth. And we have no reason to deny this. So it may be that we are just a one gene or even an expression of gene ratio's difference away from an entirely different way of processing communication between each other. And this is what the New Age, the end of history, the anticipation of this great breakthrough that we can feel but not really outline is about. If that seems far-fetched to you, you should notice how far-fetched the original emergence of language must have been. Because I think people were fully people and totally mute, or unable to articulate a thought, and then either an accumulation of neurons or some synergistic effect was brought into play, and lo and behold, spoken language emerged out of that. Well, something similar could happen to us. In the morning session, I talked about the forced evolution of language, paying attention to our language. I really think that the way to think of these psychedelics is as catalysts for the imagination. If any of you are chemists, you know a catalyst is something that when you add it to a chemical process, the process is tremendously speeded up. But in the end, the catalyst is not destroyed. The catalyst is reconstituted at the end. So psychedelics, one way of thinking of them, is as a catalyst for cognition. The original description of psychedelic drugs was they were consciousness-expanding drugs. Well, if we take the idea that they are consciousness-expanding seriously for even a moment, then we have to put a lot of attention in on this, because it's the absence of consciousness that is murdering us and our planet. We need all the consciousness we can get. We need to wring it out of computers, get it out of plants, raise it in ourselves and our children. Wherever we can get it, we need it. And the present, the present situation with the planet is very dire because of us. Our unchecked evolution in a single direction along the gradient of culture has now created a toxic planet that is an endangered planet. Since this situation has arisen entirely within the confines of history, aren't we going to have to look outside of history in order to redress this problem? I think so. And when we do look outside history, then we find the institution of plant shamanism there, waiting to inform us, to educate us, and to show us how to set a course out of the present dilemma. I don't think we can find our way out by ourselves. I don't think we can get high by ourselves, and I don't think as a species that we can save this planet by ourselves. We have to have a partner. We have to get an ally into this situation. Just in closing and as an example, the mushroom has a tremendous problem-solving ability. And because we can talk to it, we can ask it questions. We can actually get a non-human perspective on human problems. A few weeks ago, I made this statement before a group of people somewhere, and after the talk was over, somebody came up to me and said, well, so why don't you ask the mushroom how to save the world? And I just put it off, thought it was the wrong attitude. But then later I wondered about this question, how to save the world, and I thought, well, maybe I've been too circumspect with the mushroom. Maybe I should just put it to it. So I carried out the experiment and put to them, how do we save the world? And now I don't offer this as the solution. I'm going to tell you the mushroom's answer so that you can see how our backs aren't quite to the wall yet. There are still avenues to be explored. I said to the mushroom, how can we save the world? There was a hesitation of 1/3 of a second, approximately. And then the mushroom said, no woman should raise more than one natural child. And I said, what? It said, no woman should raise more than one natural child. So I took that home with me, and I thought about it. Here are the consequences of following that piece of advice. The population of the Earth would be cut in half in 50 years. 50 years following that, it would be cut in half again. 50 years after that, in half again. In 150 years, the population of the Earth could be under 1 billion people. Nobody was shot. No wars were fought. No one was told they could not have a child. No one was coerced. No one was starved. Then I started looking into this thing about children and population. And most of you, like me, probably imagine that the world has a population problem. And this population problem is going on in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh because, dagnabbit, those little brown people will just not stop having children. Well, I looked into it, and I've got a surprise for you. A child born in America will use between 600 and 1,000 times more natural resources and energy than a child born to a woman in Bangladesh. Suppose you went to Bangladesh and you met a woman, a young woman of childbearing age, and she told you that her ambition in life was to have 1,000 children. You'd be appalled. I mean, what kind of social responsibility is this? What kind of person are you that you want to do this? An American woman having one child is having the equivalent of those 1,000 infants. Now, another interesting thing about this suggestion made by the mushroom, that each woman should rear one natural child. When we think of population control schemes, the first objection is, my God, you can never sell this to people. They have these religions, they have these centuries of tradition and so forth. It just won't wash. Notice that what the mushroom suggested is most likely to be accepted by the person most important to convert. We don't want to convert the women of the back streets of Bangladesh to this policy. We want to convert the women of Sherman Oaks, Malibu, Santa Monica, Grosse Pointe, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, because these are the women whose children are using the resources. So here is, in one sentence, the mushroom was able to answer a question I put to it with a suggestion I had never dreamed of, that seems, at first glance anyway, to stand up pretty well, and I've spent a lifetime trying to figure out ways to solve human problems. See, we're a little stupid, because we're all alike. And something years ago the mushroom said to me, which deals with this, was people are always this question of enlightenment. And the mushroom said, for one human being to expect to obtain enlightenment from another is like a grain of sand on the beach expecting to attain enlightenment from another grain of sand on the beach. Don't you get it? You're all grains of sand. I mean, Joe Schmo, who runs a body shop, and Mukta Ruby Baba are the same people. There's no difference between those two guys. No reason to assume so. So I think we need help, and that little exercise in what do you do about the population problem shows that there are suggestions out there we haven't thought of, avenues we haven't tried. When I thought about why haven't we tried this avenue of one woman, one natural child, it took me about 30 seconds to understand that it's real hard to make a buck in a situation when population is retracting at a rate of 50% per generation. And our whole world is based on making a buck. I told this idea to someone and they said, but if the women of Malibu stop having children, they will lose all their political power, because political power is numerical. This is not true. Political power is power. And if the women of Malibu stop having children, they will be quite a bit wealthier than they already are. Notice that this deciding to voluntarily have one natural child is also very helpful to you personally. That a woman will have to work less hard, will have to cut fewer deals with the in-place structure of male dominance if she has only one child. A woman with 2 children has got to cut a deal with male dominance, or she has a trust fund or something. The reason we are, I think, we have a tendency to clench at this suggestion and not follow it through is because we imagine that there is something holy and sacred about the nuclear family, and that we don't want to attack this biological unit that has such integrity. But this is a bunch of nonsense. The nuclear family has no biological integrity whatsoever. It's a creation of the post-industrial Reformation. The extended family is the natural human unit to ease the pressure of child rearing on young women and to give everybody the benefit of contact, intergenerational contact, and so forth. No, this nuclear family that our politicians are always beating their breasts about is the absolute cauldron of neurosis in this society, as far as I can see. And when you look at the demographics of what is happening, the number of women with the number of households that are one woman, one child household, I think you can see that maybe our unconscious has already been in communication with the mushroom, and it's just the ego who's going to get the news last. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's an example of how these things offer solutions to human problems. And if it can offer solutions to a human problem like overpopulation by 6 billion people on a planet, then it can surely take care of the needs and concerns of a group of rainforest hunter-gatherers that number 70 or so people. I doubt they can conceive of a question that it doesn't have an answer to, because it can operate on many levels simultaneously. And this is an example of consciousness in action. You see, me plus nothing had nothing new to say about the population problem. Me plus psilocybin had a whole new take a suggestion. We can swat it down and ultimately decide it's a bunch of malarkey, but at least there was a new thought, a new try, a new hope. This is the consequences of consciousness. And we're beset by problems like this. And we shouldn't assume that they are insoluble simply because we haven't solved them. In fact, we must assume that they are soluble, or else we are not going to have a place to hang our hat in 50 years. But the solutions come through an act of humility, an act of opening to the dynamic of nature, the feminine, the psyche. The ego is the calcareous knot of tumorous tissue that stands outside of all that and cannot be trusted and cannot be relied upon. And so by attempting to dissolve that, to mitigate its hard edges, to smooth it out into the greater context of being, then we really discover what humanness is about, because humanness is not something that can be encompassed from the point of view of the ego. That's why, having created the ultimately egoistic society, we've created a society with so little humanity in it, you know? And I see the psychedelics as a siren song calling us back to what is authentic, to what is real, and to what, instead of closing off our future options, begins to open them up so that we can see that, you know, human beings are a part of the larger universal destiny, and we can comport ourselves with grace and dignity and make the world a better place than we found it, which is certainly not our record so far. But it's not too late. I mean, H.G. Wells called history a race between education and disaster. It's not mere coincidence, nor even mere synchronicity, that at this moment in time and space, with these tremendous crises bearing down upon us, that we have reached out to the archaic peoples with a new attitude, not an attitude of how can we enslave them, but how can we learn from them. My hope is that here in the final ticking of the clock of history, we are going to end our prodigal descent into the desert world of the ego and return with what we have learned, the fruits of the prodigal journeying of the errant son, which is what history has been, return with the fruits of that prodigal wandering to the larger human family that waits on us in the rainforests, in the deserts, in the marshes, in the thorn forests of this planet. The archaic people are waiting for us to get on the train, and then the train will be able to depart. But we have to awaken to our past, and then we can set a course toward a meaningful future. That's the wrap, basically. So let me explain something. The DMT flash is very brief. The mushroom experience is very long, hours. You can, if you are fortunate and took enough, on a psilocybin trip, you can work your way into a place which looks like a DMT flash, but it will take you a couple of hours of breath control and sitting in darkness and paying attention to get to this place. So I wanted to make clear that for my money, these hallucinogens all pretty much lead into the same place, but the experience of psilocybin and DMT is very different if only because one is tremendously gradual, although it may not seem like that when it's happening, but compared to DMT, it's very gradual. It unfolds over several hours, while the other, you measure the DMT flash in hundreds of seconds. I mean, it is a flash, for sure. Okay. I'll just make my way through these, and we'll do as many as we have time for, and I guess we'll go till about 4. A recent LA Times Magazine article on Mayan excavation made passing reference to hallucinogenic enemas. Any knowledge of such practice? Good question, and humorous. Enemas were invented by the New World Indians, strangely enough. It was a route of drug administration unknown to Roman or Greek medicine. The reason the people of the Amazon basin invented enemas, 2 reasons really. First of all, they had these very strong corrosive drugs that they wanted to find a route of administration for. And the second reason was they had rubber. The South American forests are the source of rubber. So they invented the first enema, the first hot water bottle, and God knows what else. Decency should probably not even inquire. I've never taken a hallucinogenic enema, but in principle it may not be a bad idea with some things that are very sickening or like that. If you do an enema, though, remember that you cut doses to 1/3. You don't do a full dose that way, or you'll leave a human-shaped hole in the roof. Once the European contact began, enemas became just a fad in Europe, and they were even doing tobacco smoke enemas at one point, which is really weird. Okay. Please explain, I guess it says, propagation and appropriate dosage of betel nuts and kava. I don't know too much about betel nuts. That's Piper beetle. It's a vice throughout Southeast Asia. You probably all know the song from South Pacific, Bloody Mary's chewing betel nut. That's what that's about. Kava is Piper methysticum. This is a plant that occurs throughout Oceania and Micronesia, and has very exotic chemistry. Bisnoryangonine and norbeocysteine are the active principles. These 2 compounds are known otherwise only from a mushroom. Kava is a kind of dreamy intoxicant. You don't feel like doing much, but you really enjoy just sitting there on the beach, and it's soporific kind of. It causes a bizarre condition which is called crocodilianism. And crocodilianism is where your skin dries and cracks and migrates into little pyramidal shapes. And when Captain Cook landed in the Hawaiian Islands, he was, of course, meeting the high mucky-mucks of the Hawaiian royalty. He thought everybody had leprosy. He didn't know what kind of a hell he'd fallen into until they put it together and said, no, these are the royal families. All of these people are suffering from kava addiction, crocodilianism. It's not pleasant tasting. It's not a pleasant high. But recently I was in another state, and I had an errand to go. A very chance errand carried me to the house of someone I didn't know. And there on the table in this house was this huge bowl, this carved Fijian kava bowl. And I walked over and looked at it, and it was full of this milky, creamy stuff. And I stuck my finger in and I tasted it, and it was kava. And I turned to the lady of the house. I said, "What's the story?" And she said, "My husband was in the Peace Corps in Fiji. He loves this stuff." And so then I met him and talked to him about it. He said, "I'm a chronic alcoholic. I can't touch a drink. I can't touch a drop, but I drink this, and I love it." And I said, "Well, do you know about crocodilianism?" And he said, "Oh, yes." And he lifted up his shirt and scratched his chest, and a huge cloud of dandruff rose. So sometimes you never know. It's the people I hang out with. Could you ask the mushroom what we should do about George Bush? I have hope for the man. He has such a botanically promising name. The ones that I'm not reading aloud are the ones which seem to go to areas of my concern that I haven't addressed here today, so I don't carry you over into them. This is an important question. What is your view of introducing psychedelics to children and the initiation of children into altered states? This is so controversial, so hot, that other than reading the question, I'm not sure what I could say. At the Bridge Conference at Stanford a few weeks ago, there was a women's panel. Kat was on it, Carolyn Garcia, Cindy Palmer-Horowitz, Nina Gravois, some of the great psychedelic women. And this is very important to discuss. Some of you may have read Odd John by Robert Bly, where he makes a tremendous case that fathers should provide initiatory experiences for their children. And, you know, we're not talking an overnight trout fishing trip here, folks. I think this definitely needs to be discussed. I'd be more comfortable with women discussing it, because I think women are the caregivers and the child rearers largely. But it's really a problem. I mean, it's a problem for us that we even do these things in a climate of legal intolerance. And then, you know, to put it on to our children, to make criminals of our children. You know, I mean, you can lose your children with a stunt like that. This is very touchy, and yet I see it as a First Amendment right. It's a matter of religious conviction. And I don't know. My hope is that someday this religious conviction issue is going to collide right into the psychedelic issue, because I do not see how we can live under a constitution that guarantees life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and say that psychedelic drugs are illegal. I mean, if the pursuit of happiness means anything, it must cover that. Now, I've had constitutional scholars explain to me that, well, no, you don't understand. Hamilton wanted it to say life, liberty, and the right to own property, and Jefferson objected, so they decided they'd put in language that was meaningless, so they settled on the pursuit of happiness. But I say, let's take that meaningless language in the Constitution and turn it into the greatest social revolution that's ever been seen. Children and psychedelics. And here's a technical question that is about mushroom media that we should spare the rest of you. All three explanations of the tykes are interesting, but are interpretations of experience. What if your tykes are contemplations which are becoming as diversely as they see themselves? The self-reflection of intelligence contains all forms. Correct. But then why these forms, and why so persistently? You know, to anybody who says something is everything devolves the obligation of explaining then why it appears to be specifically something. And I've taken lots of psychedelic compounds, and I don't get tykes anywhere else. I think this is somehow specific to the beast. Oh, this is this is more a statement than a question. Quantum mechanics, especially the Schrodinger's cat experiment, show that we are simultaneously dead and alive, rather like a Kekuli resonance structure of the two. DMT creatures are consistent with contemporary science. This is true. I mean, language is what divides, but what is divided is not divided. It simply appears divided through the convention of language. I'm real uncomfortable with this death and DMT issue because I don't know quite what to do with it. It's a little, I like profundity, but even that seemed like deeper water than I wanted to get into. How does ibogaine relate to MDMA in opening the heart? Oh, this is a funny thing about compounds. Most drugs, after their discovery, in the process of entering general awareness, undergo a phase in which they are the love drug. This happens. Marijuana has been the love drug. LSD has been the love drug. Psilocybin has been the love drug. A slightly different kind of love, but cocaine has been called the love drug. MDMA is called a heart-opening drug, and ibogaine, as I talked about. And then I've had tremendous heart openings on other things not related to this. And even DMT sends you down with an acute perception and appreciation of what a wonderful thing it is to be alive. Chemically, MDMA doesn't relate to ibogaine at all. I think this opening of the heart thing is something that many drugs make possible, and we just need to give ourselves permission to do it. The great power of MDMA is in what's called directed psychotherapy, where a therapist helps you sort out your problems. But we haven't seen, nor are we likely to see, any comparison studies of how well MDMA stacks up against LSD or psilocybin or mescaline. Some therapists have preferred MDMA because they like how it sort of stays on the surface. No titanic hallucinations, no visitations by flying saucers, just an acute awareness of what a schmuck you may have been. Well, other people want this deep material, want the dreamlike mythological stuff to be brought up. So that's sort of a matter of faddism. I think that any drug that you're unfamiliar with may well open your heart, just in poking around. Opening the heart is an act of attention in a state of unusual psychic dynamics, and the unusual psychic dynamics part can be provided by numerous substances. How rich in psychedelics are the Caribbean islands, especially Haiti and the Dominican Republic? There are psychedelic plants in the Caribbean islands. There are the mushrooms, certainly, and there are these Anodonanthera trees, the source of the Niopo snuffs, and there are daturas. There is also a fairly highly evolved folk medicine in some of those areas. If some of you are ethnobotanists or aspiring ethnobotanists, but you have language difficulty, think about some of the English-speaking islands of the Caribbean, or think about Belize. Belize is a fascinating cultural area. The three language groups of Belize are English, Spanish, and Mayan. And it's not at all unusual to meet someone who speaks Mayan and English. And that's what you're looking for, because then your informant, you can actually form a real relationship there. So there are many interesting plants in the New World tropics, including the Caribbean islands. Pardon me? Frogs. I don't know about Caribbean frogs, but since you raised this question, they're not frogs, first of all. They're toads. We don't want the toads to feel left out. This is a phenomenon that's arisen in the past few years. Some of you may know of it, that these large toads, Bufo alvaris toads, you can capture them out in the American Southwest at a certain time of year and take them back to your four-wheel drive vehicle and put pressure on the glands on the back of their neck and get them to squirt out 5-MeO DMT. Fairly pure. I mean, it looks like it must be 70% the real thing. Squirt it onto the windshield of your four-wheel drive vehicle, and then with your frost scraper, after a few hours, you can scrape this stuff up and bag it up and rush back to Berkeley and sell it on the street for $80 a gram. Toad foam. It's interesting. Toad foam is what it's called. It raises some interesting issues because, so far as I know, it's the only animal-based psychedelic to have any availability at all. There are known animal psychedelics. The most spectacular example is a fish off the coast of Norfolk Island in the South Atlantic, and this fish contains DMT, and there are other fish with DMT in them. But this toad foam is the first example of an animal-based hallucinogen actually showing up as a product on the underground. So that tree frog from Peru. This is, pardon me? Is that the Matisse word? Well, this is all Peter Gorman's field work. And I respect Peter Gorman. He's not a personal friend of mine because I haven't spent that much time with him. But he seems to know more about this than anybody else. He's the only white person to have any information firsthand about it. His account is that these extremely uncontacted people in the Amazon have a tree frog which exudes something on its belly, and they take a burning stick and burn a hole into the muscle of the upper arm, just like you would take a cigarette and burn a hole into your arm, and then they pack this hole with this material from the underbelly of this frog, and then a spectacular trip results. But this is entirely the reports of one field worker, which it's a dream come true for him. This is what we all want to do, is go off and find a powerful hallucinogen that nobody else knows anything about, and then bring it back. So that's a case of that. Here's a question, not terribly relevant, but I like talking about my friends. Can you talk a little about your association with Rupert Sheldrake? Rupert is a good friend of mine. He and Ralph Abraham and I are writing a book together. He's the morphogenetic field man, and this is an alternative hypothesis to the scientific hypothesis. One way of thinking about psychedelics, and I didn't mention it because I didn't want to have to sketch you Sheldrake's cosmology, but since the question was asked, one way of thinking about psychedelics is they amplify the morphogenetic field. We see then what connects whatever you're looking at, then you see what is connected, because the morphogenetic field, which is there all the time, but which is sort of mitigated against by our language habits, becomes suddenly visible. And then my time wave, which I've strictly avoided talking about today, is an effort on my part to actually write an equation for the Sheldrakean morphogenetic field. And you see, Rupert's idea is not that powerful until somebody can walk to a blackboard and write the equations for the morphogenetic field. Until that's done, he's in the position that James Clerk Maxwell was in vis-a-vis the electromagnetic field, until somebody then, James Clerk Maxwell in this case, figured out the inverse square law and what the constraints were, and then wrote the equations of electromagnetic radiation. Could you elaborate further on the nature of MAO inhibitors? I will, since I mentioned it and it's worth understanding. It's that monoamines are these simple chemical compounds that are very active in biological systems, including all the drugs we've been talking about and many drugs we haven't mentioned. These are all monoamines. Well, then you have a system in the body called monoamine oxidase. The ACE on the end of a word indicates you're dealing with an enzyme, transcriptase. But this is monoamine oxidase. It oxidizes monoamines. It makes them harmless byproducts. So if you take a drug, one of these monoamines, it is monoamine oxidase that will render it harmless and shunt it to your urine. But there are what are called monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And that means that if you take the MAO inhibitor, now the monoamine oxidase can't destroy the monoamine, and the monoamines accumulate, and you get high. That's what happens. And sometimes monoamine accumulation can be a self-generated toxic state, where for some reason toxic byproducts aren't breaking down. Then they will give you monoamine oxidase to oxidize these products away. But it's a reasonable strategy to try and jam the monoamine oxidase machinery to allow an exogenously introduced monoamine to then accumulate to intoxicating levels. So it's just a pharmacological strategy. Where does one obtain high-quality cubensis spore prints or cultures? Well, I mentioned my brother and I wrote a book on growing psilocybin mushrooms. You can order it out of the catalogs that are at the front. There's an ad in the back of that book for high-quality spore prints, and a company called Syzygy will send you a little plate of glass with more spore prints on it than there are people in North America. Are North American cubensis mushrooms, do they have lower potency? And can this be overcome by selective breeding? Selective breeding of mushrooms is an excruciating task. First of all, you have to be able to work with a microscope powerful enough that you can push one spore against another, keeping a third spore out of the picture. What people call breeding is where you inoculate to a plate two separate strains, and where the two growing edges meet, you cut a square out of that and austerize it and then re-inoculate. But that's not really selective breeding. Are North American cubensis mushrooms lower in potency? Yes, they are. Apparently, equatorial heat has something to do with the production of psilocybin. Say something about San Pedro cactus as a psychedelic agent. This is one of the ones that sort of got left out of the survey this morning because I was ripping right along. This is a very large columnar cactus that grows on the northeast coast of Peru and contains mescaline, just like the peyote cactus. And it has been used for a long, long time. We have pottery out of Peru, 3,000, third millennium BC of this San Pedro cactus. It's a very powerful shamanic agent. Marion Woodman, who I guess spoke to you recently, has stated one of the most noteworthy archetypes to surface in recent Analysan's dreams is the Black Madonna, a blending of mother and whore energies. Would you comment on this in the light of your psychedelic experiences and the re-emergent of the feminine energy? Well, I think, the goddess is on the move. The goddess is, this archetype is drawing energy with a fury that has not been seen since the Angevine court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's a re-imaging of deity that is going on at every level. And certainly on psychedelics, you have immense moving experiences of the goddess. If you invoke the goddess in that situation, you can confront her. This is all part of this archaic return. I mean, it's happening on many levels. And imaging the supreme power of the universe as feminine, boundaryless, penetrating, is very important. Let me say just a bit about gender politics, because sometimes people think I have no use for men. When you look at human beings against the background of the rest of nature, we are all so yang that the struggle between the masculine and the feminine is not something that should be fought out between the two varieties of human beings. A proper reconnection to the feminine would be a reconnection to the vegetable matrix. This is the passive, enfolding, caring, bearing matrix of life on the earth. And all animal life comes off as tremendously young, regardless of its sexual expression. So I think we do have work to do on gender relationships between men and women. But more than that, we all have a great deal of refeminizing to do vis-a-vis the living earth. Alrighty, right. Does one need a shaman guide in order to enter the world of sacred plants? Is there a danger in working with sacred plants without a shaman? Does one need a shaman guide in order to enter the world of sacred plants? This is the question of the sitter. You know, if you're going to experiment with these things, should you have someone sit with you? I think in the name of prudence, the answer has to be yes, at least the first time. I'm a little uncomfortable giving that advice because I don't like sitters. They hold me at the surface. And if there's a person around, that's what I end up thinking about. I want to get everybody out of the way so that I can make a very clean, deep plunge to where I'm going, and I don't want any witnesses. Because one of the things that happens in psychedelic states is often you're going through something, you're totally ecstatic, but the presentation of it is crisis-like. There you are, you're on the ground, covered with dirt, moaning, screaming, and you say, are you all right? Is something wrong? And the answer is no, nothing's wrong, everything is fine. But the person who has the expectations of the culture of what means right and wrong will bring you down with their... And this is why, remember in Cien Años de Soledad, when José Arcadia Buendia chained himself to the tree? This is a good technique. I've done this. I've chained myself to a tree so that I would not present a problem to myself. And then I took it with perfect confidence all by myself because I knew I couldn't get away from my tree. Although maybe I could fall out of my tree. Is there a danger in working with sacred plants without a shaman? Well, I suppose the New Age answer is certainly. My answer is no less danger than there is working with a shaman, I would say. I mean, you got to watch these shamans, you know. They're a fairly beady-eyed lot. It is the archetype of the trickster. Don't forget that. I mean, the notion that this is just some open-hearted little forest fellow who wants to tell you all his hard-won secrets. I mean, that's a cheerful assumption. Of course, you don't want to go too far the other way. I find over and over in the Amazon when I'm off with these people, we come to the place where now we've taken the ayahuasca or whatever it is, and I'm sitting across the fire looking at this guy, and I realize, we're 4 days up this river and 2 days down this trail, and then I realize with perfect certainty that they're going to kill me right there that evening. You have to have a chat with yourself about this kind of thing well ahead of time, because you must be able to discipline your hind brain. Your hind brain is always telling you crazy stuff to blow your focus. And you just have to say, no, he's not going to kill me. And even if he tried, I'm bigger than he is. So, and work your way out. But this thing of cross-cultural shamanism, I don't really know what to do with it. I see the shamans, noble souls, brought from the Peruvian jungles, and they do not do well in these cultures. We don't understand what a corrosive force we are. We don't understand what an air ticket to Paris means to somebody who's never been to the big town at the bottom of the river. And we tend to hold things so close to our chest that we smother them. I think it would be a good idea to leave the shamans in the jungle, and if it's so damn important to you to spend time with them, then bite the bullet. Go there. Go to them. I mean, what kind of spiritual quest is this where we fly the teacher in to a waiting group of sycophants? How are we doing? We're not doing so well. That was the last question, folks. Well, I'll smooth the gaffe by saying this is important, and it may sound like fluff, but it isn't. We look exactly like everybody else to most people. And we will now leave this hall and disappear back into our lives. But you might take a moment. This is your affinity group. It's preposterous, demeaning, and unhealthy to focus on one person. The Terence McKenna, the Tim Leary, the John Lilly. I mean, hell yes, we're great people. But so are you. And this is your affinity group. Someone in this room has what you need. Someone in this room appreciates what you've got. So look at each other and pay attention. We are each like a virus, empowered now to go out in society and spread this new meme, this new permission, this new community of awareness of the archaic option. And so I think you are to be congratulated. You are what makes this all go. If it weren't for you, I would be behind bars. I don't know whether it would be a mental hospital or a state prison, but they'd figure that out later. Thanks to you, we have a movement. And this movement offers hope. And I think we need to speak clearly about this hope to people who are not aware of it. An idea has no power unless it is communicated. And we are to some degree in the closet. We are prudent. We don't say we're gutless. We say we're prudent. We're prudent. Say, this is no political climate in which to be X, Y, and Zing. But actually, there's no better political climate than the present in which to raise these issues, because the rainforests are being destroyed, the native cultures are being destroyed, our authenticity as free-thinking people is being destroyed, all around the issue of the suppression of altered states and freedom to conduct the spiritual quest any way we want. And if we don't raise our voices in protest against this, then without doubt it will be slowly drained away, and we will be left in even more of a psychic desert than we already inhabit. So this is the last opportunity. I think that in 100 years the earth will be empty. And whether that will be because we are extinct or because we found home is entirely up to us. But our story, the story of the errant monkey, is coming to an end. The final seconds of that story are ticking out. Is it to be followed by no more story or a new chapter, a new story? Well, this has to do with how much integrity, how much self-generated love, and how much intelligence we can bring to bear to the human dilemma. And these plants, these sacraments, are central to a full exploration and understanding of what it means to be a human being. It's just that simple. Thank you very much.